He walked into that courtroom like he owned it, because he thought he did. $4.2 billion. The most expensive legal team in New York, a 27-year-old on his arm in a red dress, and an offer,
everything.
$5 million for the woman who had quietly, invisibly, built everything he was about to claim as his own. She sat across the aisle in a 3-season-old blazer with $47 in her purse. No lawyer, no money, no plan. And she said no.
This is the critical juncture.
What Marcus Weston did not know, what nobody in that courtroom knew, was that the quiet woman across the aisle had spent 25 years becoming exactly the kind of dangerous that does not announce itself. He was about to find out. The turn. What happens next will shock you. Not once, not twice, but in ways that will make you question everything you think you know about patience, power, and what it really means to win. Stay until the final ruling, because the moment that judge speaks, your jaw will drop. Value statement. This is not just a story about a divorce. This is a masterclass in surviving the unsurvivable and rebuilding something better on the other side. Meaning because the truth does not stay buried forever, and the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous. If this sounds like something you need to hear today, keep watching. And if someone you love needs this story right now, share it before you even finish.
They said he was untouchable. $4.2 billion. A penthouse on Fifth Avenue. A legal team that had never lost a case in 20 years. And on the morning of the most important day of his wife's life, Marcus Weston walked into Manhattan Supreme Court with his 27-year-old girlfriend on his arm, wearing a $12,000 suit and a smile that said he had already counted the money. He was offering Claire, his wife of 25 years, the mother of his daughter, the woman who had given up her PhD at MIT to support his dream, exactly $5 million. Less than 0.1% of what he was worth. He called it generous. The woman sitting across the courtroom said nothing. Claire Holloway Weston sat perfectly still in a navy blazer that was 3 seasons out of date, her dark hair pulled back, her hands folded calmly on a stack of manila folders. She did not look at Marcus. She did not look at Savannah Blake, the influencer in the red dress who was already mentally redecorating the penthouse. She did not cry, or tremble, or whisper to her attorney. She simply waited, and waiting, it turned out, was the most dangerous thing she could possibly do. Because Claire Weston had been waiting for 25 years. She had been waiting and watching and quietly building something that Marcus, for all his billions and his lawyers and his absolute certainty that he had already won, could not see coming. The room, on that November morning, had no idea what it was about to witness. Neither did Marcus. Before we begin, here is what this story will teach you. The best revenge is not making him suffer. It is building a life so extraordinary that he becomes completely irrelevant, and sometimes the quietest person in the room has been planning the longest. This is the story of Claire Weston, the woman who lost everything and then took it all back. The day Claire Weston lost everything began at 9:14 in the morning, in an empty office that smelled like stale coffee and abandonment. She had arrived at her attorney's office on Lexington Avenue for what she believed was a routine mediation preparation meeting. She had dressed carefully. The navy blazer, low heels, hair pinned back. She had rehearsed the key points in the cab on the way over. She had allowed herself, for the first time in months, to feel something that resembled cautious optimism. The receptionist desk was empty when she walked in. The waiting area was empty. The conference room door stood open, showing a table with no papers, no water glasses, no prepared documents. Claire stood in the doorway of her attorney's office and looked at the single sheet of paper centered on the otherwise bare desk. She crossed the room slowly, the way you move toward something you already know is going to hurt. The note was handwritten. 4 sentences. Mrs. Weston, I am deeply sorry. I am unable to continue representing you in this matter. Please seek alternative counsel immediately. No explanation, no forwarding number, no return of her retainer. Just a note and a man-shaped absence where her legal strategy used to be. Claire stood there for a long moment. Then her phone buzzed. 3 notifications arrived in the span of 11 seconds. First, a banking alert informing her that all joint accounts associated with the Weston household had been frozen pending legal review. Second, an email from Victor Crane, Marcus's attorney, informing her in smooth professional language that Marcus had filed an emergency motion citing concerns about her mental and emotional stability. A temporary restraining order had been obtained. She was not permitted to return to the Fifth Avenue residence until further notice. Third, a text from her daughter Emma. 3 sentences. Dad told me what you've been doing. I need some space. Please don't call me right now. Claire read the text twice. Then she sat down on the floor of her attorney's empty office in her carefully chosen navy blazer with $47 in her purse and nowhere to go. This was despair, peak number 1. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a woman sitting on a commercial carpet in a vacant office, holding a phone that suddenly felt like a brick, understanding that every safety net she thought she had was gone simultaneously. The lawyer, the money, the home, the daughter, all of it in 11 seconds. She called the only number she could think of. Rachel Holloway answered on the first ring. Rachel was 49, ran a bakery in Brooklyn, and had been Claire's older sister for her entire life. She answered the way she answered everything, immediately and without ceremony. Claire said, very quietly, I think I just lost everything. Rachel said, Where are you exactly? Claire told her. Rachel said, Stay there. I am bringing coffee, and do not ask about the other thing I am bringing. 20 minutes later, Rachel Holloway arrived at the empty office carrying 2 large coffees and inexplicably a wooden baseball bat. Claire looked at the bat for a long moment. Rachel, she said, why do you have that? Rachel set it against the wall and handed Claire a coffee. I do not know yet, she said, but I feel better having it. Now tell me everything. So Claire told her. She told her about the frozen accounts, the restraining order, the empty office, the note. She told her about Marcus's attorney and the mental instability filing. She told her about Emma's text. Rachel listened without interrupting, which for Rachel was a significant act of love. When Claire finished, Rachel said, Okay, here is what is going to happen. You are going to come stay with me above the bakery. We are going to figure this out. And that man is going to regret every single decision he has made since approximately 1998. Claire wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. He took everything, Rachel, she said. I do not even know who I am without any of it. Rachel leaned forward. You are Claire Elizabeth Holloway, she said. You are my baby sister. You are the person who got a perfect score on her mathematics qualifying exam at MIT while I was barely passing 10th grade algebra. That man has spent 25 years convincing you that you are small, but I never forgot what you actually are. And starting right now, we are going to make sure he remembers too. They sat in the empty office for a few more minutes. Then Claire stood up, smoothed her jacket, picked up her folder of documents, the only evidence she had managed to grab before security escorted her from the Fifth Avenue apartment 3 days earlier, and followed her sister out the door. She did not know, as she walked out of that office building into the cold October air, that she was walking into the most important fight of her life. She did not know she was going to win it. She just knew she had Rachel, $47, and a folder of documents she was not even sure meant anything. Sometimes that is enough to start. Here is something worth pausing on before we go further. Financial dependence is not love. It is leverage. If you are in a relationship where one person controls all the money and the other person controls none, you are not equal partners. You are a primary and a dependent. And the moment that relationship ends, the person with the money holds every single card. Claire Weston learned this the hard way. You do not have to. Whatever your situation, open your own account, know your own credit score, understand what assets exist in your name, not because you are planning for divorce, but because knowing your own financial position is not distrust. It is dignity. That night, in the small apartment above Rachel's Bakery in Brooklyn, Claire sat at the kitchen table and began to tell her sister the whole story, not the version Marcus told, the version where she was a bitter, financially dependent woman grasping at a life she had never contributed to. The real version, the one that started 26 years ago at an MIT faculty mixer when a charming business major with big ideas and no technical skills had walked up to a graduate student in applied mathematics and said, "I think you might be the smartest person I have ever met." His name was Marcus Weston, and he was right. She just did not understand, at 22, what he planned to do about it. It is possible to lose a quarter of a century without noticing it happening. That is the particular horror of a slow-motion betrayal. It does not arrive all at once. It arrives in increments, each one small enough to explain away, each one building on the last, until one day you look around and realize that the life you are living belongs entirely to someone else. Claire Holloway arrived at MIT in the fall of 1994 with a full scholarship and a research focus that her thesis advisor, Professor Harold Bennett, described as 15 years ahead of its time. She was studying recursive data compression, a theoretical mathematical model that could, if made practical, revolutionize the way computers processed and stored information. She was 20 years old. She had never failed at anything academic in her life. She intended to have her PhD by 24 and spend the rest of her career teaching and publishing research at whatever university was lucky enough to have her. She met Marcus Weston at a faculty mixer in October of 1996. He was a business school student, 2 years older, doing a joint program between MBA coursework and technology entrepreneurship. He was tall, confident, and immediately intensely interested in everything Claire was saying. She was not used to that. She was used to being the smartest person in the room and the most invisible. Marcus made her feel like both things could coexist. That her intelligence was not a social liability, but an extraordinary gift that he personally recognized and valued. He asked her to explain her research over coffee. She did. He leaned forward across the table and said, "This is going to change everything. I can feel it, and I want to help make it happen." Looking back, from the distance of 25 years, Claire could identify the exact moment she should have been suspicious. That sentence, because Marcus Weston had no mathematical ability whatsoever. He had failed 2 quantitative analysis courses. He understood nothing about recursive algorithms or data compression theory. He could not have helped her research if he had wanted to. What he wanted was something different entirely. Over the following 6 months, Claire worked nights and weekends translating her theoretical model into actual working code. Marcus sat across the table from her during those sessions, asking questions, taking notes, learning the vocabulary, understanding enough to pitch the concept to an investor with the enthusiasm and fluency of someone who had invented it himself. He told her they were a team, partners. He said, what was his was hers, and what was hers was his. She believed him. In the spring of 1998, Claire discovered she was pregnant. Emma arrived early, in a complicated delivery that left Claire in the hospital for 3 days. On April 14th, 1999, the day after Emma was born, Marcus filed the patent for the data compression algorithm in his name alone. Claire did not find out until years later. By then, the company was worth $40 million. Marcus told her it did not matter whose name was on the paperwork. He said they were a family. He said the company was the family's future. He said she should focus on Emma, who needed her, and not worry about the business details. She focused on Emma. She attended the charity galas and smiled for the photographers. She raised their daughter while Marcus built his empire. She noticed, over the years, the younger women at company dinners who laughed too readily at Marcus's jokes and lingered too long in his orbit. She said nothing. She kept mental notes. She told herself this was not what it looked like. By the time she admitted to herself what it actually looked like, Emma was 20, and the company was worth $30 billion, and Claire had not had a bank account in her own name since 1999. The day she found the wire transfer confirmation, intercepted by accident when Marcus's private email notification appeared on a shared device, was the day everything changed. $200 million transferred to an account in the Cayman Islands, an account she had never heard of and was absolutely not listed on any of the marital financial disclosures she had ever reviewed. Claire Weston sat in the kitchen of the Fifth Avenue penthouse and looked at that notification for a long time. Then she opened a new email account in her maiden name. She hired a forensic accountant named Gerald Morrison through a referral from a women's legal resources organization she had found online. She began building a file. She spent 4 months doing this quietly, carefully, telling no one. Not Rachel, not any of her friends, not her daughter. She attended galas and charity committees and smiled for cameras while Gerald Morrison traced the money and she documented everything she could find. She thought she was being careful. She did not know that Marcus had a system for monitoring exactly this kind of thing, and she did not know that the forensic accountant she had trusted completely had already taken a phone call from Victor Crane. She would find out soon enough. The Manhattan Supreme Court building on a November morning is not a welcoming place. The marble floors amplify every sound. The high ceilings make people feel small. The benches are hard and the light is institutional, and the whole architecture of the space communicates, without subtlety, that this is a place where consequences live. Claire Holloway Weston had requested and been granted a 2-week continuance after the disaster of that first day, the day she had arrived without an attorney, been approached by Victor Crane with a doubled settlement offer of $10 million, turned it down with shaking hands, and stood before Judge Monroe alone. That moment, turning down $10 million with $47 in her purse and no legal representation, had been either the bravest thing Claire had ever done or the most catastrophic. She had spent 2 weeks finding out which one. The young woman who had approached her in the courthouse hallway that first day was named Evelyn Cross. She was 29 years old. She had graduated from Columbia Law 3 years earlier and had, by her own admission, never handled anything remotely this complicated. She had no staff, no resources, and a 1-bedroom apartment in Washington Heights that she was paying for on a public interest attorney's salary. She had also watched Victor Crane destroy her mother in a divorce proceeding 15 years ago. Her mother had died 3 years later, broken, in a 1-room apartment in Queens. Evelyn Cross had been waiting her entire legal career for a case that would put her across the table from Victor Crane. In the courthouse hallway, she had looked at Claire and said, "I know who I would be going up against. I know I probably should not do this, but I think you might be my one chance, and I think I might be yours." Claire had looked at this young woman with the serious eyes and the modest gray suit, and thought, either this is exactly right or this is the end. She said yes. The war room was not in a gleaming law office with skyline views. It was in the cramped back room of Rachel's Bakery in Brooklyn, surrounded by flour-dusted shelves and the perpetual scent of butter and fresh bread. But in the 2 weeks since Evelyn had taken the case, it had become the most important room in Claire's life. Whiteboards lined every available wall. Timelines, financial records, connection maps, lists of questions. Evelyn worked 18-hour days. Rachel kept them supplied with coffee, and, when things were especially grim, with the good croissants she normally saved for paying customers. It was Claire who found the first real weapon. She had been staring at the original patent filing, the document Marcus had submitted on April 14th, 1999. The date she had been in the hospital, the date she had very nearly died delivering their daughter. She looked at the date for a long moment. Then she looked at Evelyn. She said, "My PhD thesis advisor is named Harold Bennett. He was my dissertation chair at MIT before I dropped out. He kept every student file since 1972. His wife calls him a hoarder. He lives in Vermont." Evelyn was already reaching for her laptop. 3 days later, they drove 4 hours north to a small farmhouse outside Burlington. Harold Bennett was 79 years old, mostly deaf, and initially, upon finding 2 women he did not recognize on his front porch on a Wednesday morning, deeply suspicious. He made them wait outside while he finished his crossword puzzle. "I do not rush for lawyers," he announced when he finally opened the door, "or billionaires, or their ex-wives. The crossword does not wait for drama." When Claire said her maiden name, Holloway, his expression changed completely. The barn behind the farmhouse had been converted into a storage facility, filing cabinets from floor to ceiling, each labeled by year and student name. After 45 minutes of searching, Professor Bennett pulled out a thick manila folder. Inside were Claire's original research notes, handwritten, dated, initialed by Professor Bennett as part of the standard academic review process. The date on the final document was February 18th, 1998, 14 months before Marcus filed his patent. Claire held the folder with both hands and felt her legs go unsteady. "This proves it was my work," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Evelyn was already photographing every page. "This proves more than that," she said. "This proves Marcus Weston committed patent fraud. He filed a patent for intellectual property that did not belong to him. This could invalidate the legal foundation of his entire company." Professor Bennett cleared his throat. "There is something else you should know," he said. He told them about the visit, 6 months after Claire dropped out. A well-dressed young man, arrogant, said he was her husband, wanted to purchase any copies of her research the professor might have retained. Bennett told him he did not do business with men who came sniffing around his students. He told him the files would remain in his possession until he died. He told him that if he returned, he would report him to the University Ethics Board. He looked at Claire with unexpected gentleness. "I always wondered what happened to you," he said. "I always wondered if you knew." Claire could not speak. The tears came without warning, the way they do when you have been holding something for so long that the moment someone finally sees the truth of it, your body simply gives up trying to keep it inside. "I know now," she finally managed, "and I am going to make sure everyone else knows too." The drive back to New York was quiet for a long time. Then Evelyn said, "This changes everything. If we can prove the patent was fraudulent, we can challenge not just the settlement, but the entire ownership structure of the company." "But the prenup still stands," Claire said, "even with the patent evidence." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me about the day you signed the prenup." The prenuptial agreement had been presented to Claire on the evening before her wedding. 300 guests had already arrived in New York for the ceremony the following morning. Her parents had spent their life savings on the event. Her mother, who was dying of cancer and had been told she had perhaps 6 months left, had flown in from Ohio. Marcus came to her hotel room that night with a folder of documents and a calm, reasonable expression. He told her his lawyers required a prenuptial agreement. He told her it was just a formality. He said if she loved him and trusted him, she would sign without reading it, because reading it would imply she did not trust him. And if she did not trust him, maybe they should have a serious conversation about whether this wedding should happen at all, in front of 300 guests, with her dying mother asleep down the hall. She was 22 years old. She signed. "That is coercion," Evelyn said flatly. "A contract signed under that kind of duress is not legally valid. If we can prove the circumstances, we can void it entirely." For the first time in weeks, Claire allowed herself to feel something that resembled hope. She did not know, as they drove through the darkness toward New York, that Marcus had already learned about the Vermont visit. She did not know what was coming, but she was about to find out. The resumed hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. The gallery was packed. Legal observers, board members from Weston Technologies, who had heard rumors and come to assess the damage to their stock options, and reporters filling every available seat in the back rows. Marcus Weston sat at the petitioner's table with Victor Crane, his confidence somewhat diminished from the first day, but still fundamentally intact. Crane had assured him the Vermont professor was a minor complication. The prenup was solid. The offshore accounts were invisible. The plan was holding. Claire entered with Evelyn, both women carrying boxes of documents. Rachel sat in the front row of the gallery in her good church dress, arms folded, radiating the specific energy of a woman who has driven 4 hours and is prepared to stay as long as necessary. Evelyn presented the Vermont evidence methodically, the research notes, the dated timeline. Professor Bennett's video testimony, his voice steady and clear. Claire Holloway developed that algorithm. It was entirely her original work. Marcus Weston contributed nothing to the underlying mathematics. The courtroom was very quiet when Evelyn finished. Judge Patricia Monroe, 61 years old, 35 years on the bench, a woman whose face had absorbed more lies than most people would encounter in 10 lifetimes, looked at the evidence with an expression that gave nothing away. Then Victor Crane stood up. He smiled. "The petitioner does not dispute that Mrs. Weston contributed to early research," he said smoothly. "However, we have evidence that will place this matter in proper context." He turned toward the gallery doors. "We call Emma Weston to the stand." Claire felt the room tilt. Her daughter. Her 22-year-old daughter, Emma, whom she had not seen in 3 weeks because Marcus had convinced her to move into his new apartment in Tribeca. Emma, who had texted her not to call. Emma walked into the courtroom wearing a business suit Claire had never seen before. Her hair was styled differently. She did not look at her mother as she took the oath and sat down. Crane led her through the testimony with practiced gentleness. Emma's voice was flat and rehearsed. "My mother was emotionally absent. She resented my father's success because she could not achieve anything on her own. She complained constantly. She said my father stole her ideas, but she never had any proof. It was jealousy. This was despair, peak number 2. Not the words themselves, though the words were devastating, but the specific experience of sitting 3 feet away from your child while she described you as a failure and a parasite, and not being allowed to respond, not being allowed to explain, not being able to reach across the space between you and say, "This is not the truth, and you know it is not, and I need you to remember who I actually am." Claire sat completely still. She did not cry. She did not react. The cameras in the gallery captured her stillness, and the reporters would later describe it as coldness, as detachment, as evidence of exactly the emotional absence Emma was describing. What it actually was the most extraordinary act of self-control Claire Weston had ever performed in her life. That night, in Rachel's apartment, she did not hold it together. She sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets and cried the way you cry when the grief is so large it has no shape, just sound and shaking and the awful physical weight of it. Rachel sat beside her on the floor, did not try to reframe it or fix it or find the silver lining, just put her arm around her sister and stayed there. After a long time, Rachel said quietly, "You know what Mom always said?" She said, "The people who try to use your love against you are counting on that love being stronger than your survival instinct." She paused. Do not let them be right. The second catastrophic event arrived at 6:47 the following morning as a news notification on Evelyn's phone. Breaking. Viral video appears to show Weston wife in romantic encounter. New evidence surfaces in contentious divorce trial. The video had already reached 9 million views. Grainy footage of Claire embracing a man at a coffee shop, sitting close, laughing, his hand briefly on her arm as he leaned toward her to say something. The caption, "Billionaire wife's secret affair exposed." The man in the video was Claire's cousin Michael, whom she had not seen in 4 years and who had been passing through New York for a single day in September. They had met for 45 minutes at a coffee shop in Midtown. He had hugged her hello and hugged her goodbye. The internet did not care about this information. By 9 in the morning, Claire had received 43 threatening messages in her email inbox. By noon, someone had posted Rachel's bakery address in the comments section of the video with the caption, "This is where she's hiding." That evening, a brick came through Rachel's front window. Rachel stood in the middle of the bakery looking at the broken glass on her grandmother's original hardwood floor, at the brick with the handwritten note that said, "Home Wrecker," at the cold November air, coming in through the hole where the window had been. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "This man has made a very serious mistake." The third catastrophic event came from an unexpected direction. Betty Simmons arrived at Rachel's door at 11 in the evening. She was 58, had been Claire's housekeeper for 15 years, and was holding a worn composition notebook in both hands like it was something precious and slightly dangerous. She said, "Mrs. Weston, I heard what happened. I am sorry about your daughter. I need to show you something." She set the notebook on Rachel's kitchen table. 15 years, she said. Dates, times, names of women Mr. Weston brought to the house when you were traveling. Financial conversations I overheard. Threats he made to staff members who asked too many questions. Everything I witnessed that I knew someday you would need. Claire stared at the notebook. "You kept records," she said, "all this time." "I write things down," Betty said simply. "I always thought this day would come." Evelyn Cross picked up the notebook and began to read. Her professional composure, which had held remarkably steady through the Vermont trip and the Vermont evidence, and even through Emma's testimony, began to visibly crack. "Betty," she said, "did you ever consider law school?" Betty, completely serious. "I considered it. The hours seemed unreasonable. But the notebook, extraordinary as it was not the most important thing Betty had brought. The envelope she produced from her coat pocket. That was the most important thing. My daughter works as a paralegal in Midtown, Betty said. She overheard something she should not have. She printed what she found and brought it to me last night. The envelope contained printed email chains between Victor Crane and a private investigator. Subject lines regarding a project labeled simply Video Asset. Discussion of staging, editing, and distribution timeline. The fake video was not Marcus's idea. The order had come from Savannah Blake. They read the documents in silence around Rachel's kitchen table. The clock on the wall said 12:40. No one suggested going to sleep. Savannah Blake, 27, lifestyle influencer, 3.1 million followers. The woman who had walked into Manhattan Supreme Court on Marcus's arm in a dress that the press had spent 200 words describing, had hired a private investigator 3 years before she ever met Marcus Weston. The investigator's initial report, dated 21 months before Savannah and Marcus had apparently begun their relationship, was a comprehensive profile of Marcus Weston. His assets, his legal vulnerabilities, the structure of his marriage, the financial pressure points that might accelerate a divorce settlement, his known pattern of behavior with younger women in his professional circle. Savannah had not fallen in love with Marcus Weston. She had identified him as a target. The plan, reconstructed from the emails, was methodical. Become indispensable to Marcus personally. Accelerate the breakdown of his marriage. Ensure that his wife received as little as possible in any settlement. Marry Marcus. Allow a period of apparent stability. Then, at a strategically chosen moment, expose his financial crimes and present herself as an innocent spouse who had known nothing, inheriting the resulting settlements and assets in the aftermath. Weston Technologies was not a love story. It was an acquisition target. Claire read through the documents twice. Then she set them down on the table and stared at the kitchen wall for a moment. She was never interested in Marcus, Claire said. She wanted the company. Evelyn, reading a separate page, and she nearly had it. Rachel, from the doorway, holding a croissant she had forgotten she was eating. I cannot believe I'm about to say this, but that is, actually, an impressive amount of planning. She paused. Absolutely not. Still absolutely not. But the planning was impressive. No one disagreed. The fake video had been commissioned 6 weeks earlier. The private investigator had surveilled Claire for 3 weeks to find moments that could be recontextualized. The cousin Michael, completely innocent, 400 miles away in Boston when the video went viral, had simply been the most usable footage. This matters, Evelyn said, because it is not just visual evidence of the fake video. It is evidence that Savannah was running a parallel operation designed to destroy you, independent of Marcus. If we can authenticate these emails, we can introduce them as evidence of coordinated fraud. It changes the entire picture of what happened in this courtroom. Claire looked at the documents. Something had shifted in her, sitting at Rachel's kitchen table at nearly 1 a.m, with broken glass still in the bakery downstairs and her daughter's voice still echoing in her memory. For 25 years, she had accommodated. She had adjusted. She had found ways to make peace with each new indignity because the alternative, confronting it directly, had always seemed more dangerous than the thing itself. That woman was gone. What had replaced her was someone who had been pushed to the absolute bottom and had discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was still standing. Someone who had lost the money and the home and the lawyer and very nearly the daughter, and had found that she was still, fundamentally, herself. Find everything there is to find about Savannah Blake, Claire said. Financial history, prior relationships, any other men she may have targeted before Marcus. If this was a pattern, there is evidence of it somewhere. Evelyn was already typing. And we need to deal with the second prenup, Claire said. The one from 215. I was on prescription medication. My doctor has records. We fight it the same way we fought the first one. With documentation and witnesses. She looked around the table at the three women who had stayed when everyone else had left. They think they have won because I am running out of resources and time, she said. But they made one mistake. They pushed me into a corner with people who actually love me, and people with nothing left to lose are very difficult to stop. Rachel raised her coffee cup. To the most dangerous woman in Brooklyn, she said. Betty raised hers. To writing everything down, Evelyn raised hers. To Victor Crane, she said, who has no idea what is coming. The second prenuptial agreement, dated June 15, 2015, had been presented to Claire 3 weeks after her miscarriage. She had been on a combination of antidepressants and sedatives prescribed by her physician following the loss. She had, during that period, signed whatever Marcus placed in front of her because the cognitive and emotional resources required to read a legal document were simply unavailable to her. Her physician had records. The prescription records were precise. The dates matched exactly. But more importantly, Evelyn found something else. 2 witnesses to the signing, a notary and an assistant from Marcus's legal team, who had, in the 3 years since, left Weston's employ under circumstances that were, according to the documents Betty's daughter had accessed, not entirely voluntary. One of them had left a paper trail. His name was Daniel Price. He had been a junior associate at Crane's firm in 2015. He had left 6 months after the prenup signing, following what the firm's internal documents described vaguely as a philosophical disagreement regarding client representation ethics. He was currently practicing family law in Philadelphia. Evelyn called him at 8 in the morning. He answered on the 3rd ring. He listened to what she said. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, I have been waiting for this call for 3 years. Tell me when you need me there. The prenup ruling came on a Thursday morning, and for approximately 48 hours, Claire Weston allowed herself to believe they had won. Judge Monroe heard the arguments regarding both prenuptial agreements over the course of a single morning session. Evelyn presented the evidence of coercion for the 1998 agreement. 3 witnesses who had attended the wedding and remembered Claire's distress the night before, including a bridesmaid who recalled finding Claire crying in the hotel bathroom, saying she felt she had no choice. She presented Daniel Price's testimony regarding the circumstances of the 2015 signing, supported by Claire's medical records showing the precise medications she had been prescribed and the documented cognitive impairment associated with them. Victor Crane objected 4 times. Judge Monroe overruled him 4 times. The prenuptial agreement signed in 1998, Judge Monroe said, was obtained through coercion. Multiple credible witnesses have testified that the respondent was given no meaningful opportunity to review the document or seek independent counsel, and was explicitly threatened with public humiliation if she declined to sign. This document is void. She set it aside. The prenuptial agreement dated June 2015 was signed while the respondent was under the documented influence of prescription medications following a pregnancy loss. Her physician's records confirm she was not in a condition to provide informed consent to a binding legal document. This document is also void. She set that one aside too. The gallery erupted. Evelyn allowed herself, for the first time since taking the case, a small and genuine smile. Rachel, in the front row, pressed both fists against her mouth to contain a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a shout. Marcus, at the petitioner's table, had gone very still. That evening at the bakery, they celebrated with the wine Rachel had been saving for a special occasion and croissants warm from the oven. Claire sat at the table feeling something she had almost forgotten the texture of: lightness. The particular physical sensation of weight being removed. "We might actually do this," she said. "We are doing this," Evelyn corrected. "The algorithm evidence stands. Betty's testimony will corroborate the abuse pattern. Without the prenups, you are entitled to equitable distribution of everything." Rachel raised her glass. "To the man who thought he had won," she said. They clinked glasses. Claire went to sleep that night feeling, for the first time in months, that things were going to be all right. She should have known that Marcus Weston did not lose gracefully. She woke up to a news notification at 5:47 in the morning. Marcus's legal team had filed an emergency motion with new evidence, a holding company. A structure that Marcus claimed in the filing placed the controlling interest of Weston Technologies outside the definition of marital assets entirely. The First Light Trust, the filing said, was a fraudulent document, backdated and forged, and Marcus was requesting an immediate forensic audit. Claire sat up in Rachel's spare bedroom and read the notification twice. She had never heard of the First Light Trust. 3 in the morning on a Sunday. Rain against Rachel's windows. Claire awake in the dark, spare bedroom staring at the ceiling. A knock at the apartment door. Rachel appeared in the hallway. Claire appeared behind her. They looked at each other. Then Rachel opened the door. Emma Weston stood in the hallway soaking wet, still wearing the work clothes she had put on 20 hours earlier, holding a small USB drive in both hands like it was the most important object in the world, which, as it turned out, it was. "Mom," she said. Then she stopped. The word had cost her something significant. Claire moved first. She crossed the hallway and put her arms around her daughter and Emma, 22 years old. Honors graduate in computer science, the young woman who had stood in a courtroom and testified against her own mother, made a sound that had nothing rehearsed about it at all. It took an hour for Emma to calm down enough to speak clearly. Rachel made tea. Betty, who had been sleeping on Rachel's couch all week, sat quietly in the corner chair and said nothing, which was, under the circumstances, a profound kindness. "I believed him," Emma said. Her hands were around her mug. "He told me you were trying to destroy him, that the divorce was revenge for his success, that you had never actually contributed to anything, and you were using the courts to take what was not yours." She looked at her mother. "I wanted to believe him. Believing him was easier than thinking he had been lying to me my whole life." "What changed?" Claire asked. Emma had been looking for a document in Marcus's home office, a recommendation letter for a business school application. She opened the wrong folder. The folder was labeled Project Silence. Emma navigated to Evelyn's laptop and began transferring files from the USB drive while she talked. Project Silence was a 2-year operational document. Detailed, phased, written in the clean, impersonal language of corporate strategy. Phase 1, Financial Isolation. Freeze all joint accounts. Bribe opposing counsel to abandon the case, file mental instability claims. Phase 2, Social Destruction. Commission fabricated video evidence. Place tabloid stories. Discredit and isolate all witnesses and supporters. Phase 3, Family Severance. The heading that made Emma's voice go flat when she read it aloud. Leverage daughter as testimony asset through sustained emotional manipulation and strategic financial incentivization. Leverage daughter as testimony asset. Emma set down the printout. Her jaw was tight. He listed me as an asset, she said. Claire reached across the table and covered her daughter's hand. You are not what he made you, she said quietly. You never were. But that was not the end of it. Emma said, there is something else. She explained the encrypted folder. 6 months ago, an email had arrived from an address she did not recognize, containing a file she had assumed was spam and nearly deleted. It had been sent by Gerald Morrison, the forensic accountant who had recanted his testimony against Marcus. Morrison had not recanted because he was lying. He had recanted because Marcus had made a phone call to Morrison's elderly mother in Florida and described, in specific detail, what could happen to people whose family members did not cooperate with certain requests. Before he recanted, Morrison had sent everything to Emma, because, his note explained, daughters always figure out the truth eventually. He said when she was ready to see who her father really was, she would know what to do with the files. The encryption took Emma 3 hours to break. She had started at midnight. When the files loaded, they saw everything. $214 million in offshore accounts. Shell companies in Panama, the Cayman Islands, and Switzerland. Securities fraud documentation going back 11 years, and a file labeled First Light Trust. Evelyn pulled up the incorporation documents, read them in silence for a long moment, then read them again. This is a private trust, she said slowly, established in 2005. The trustee is a New York estate attorney named Robert Fielding, who retired in 2019. She scrolled further. The beneficiary designation, she said, upon verified proof of marital infidelity by the named party, Marcus Elliott Weston, during the course of his marriage to Claire Elizabeth Holloway Weston, controlling interest in all Weston Technology Holdings transfers to the wrong spouse. The room was completely silent. Someone set this up to protect you, Evelyn said. 20 years ago, someone who knew this day might come and prepared for it. Claire sat very still. Her mind moved through the list of people who could have known enough 20 years ago to structure something like this. Her family had no money. Her friends had no knowledge of trust law. There was only one person with both the resources and the legal access. Dorothy, she said. Who? Rachel asked. Marcus's mother, Claire said. Dorothy Weston. She died 5 years ago. We were close. She never approved of how her son treated me. She used to say he had inherited his father's ambition without his integrity. Emma was already navigating deeper into the files. She found a scanned document, a handwritten letter dated 2005, in an elegant and careful script that Claire recognized immediately. She had received birthday cards in that handwriting for 15 years. She took the letter from Evelyn and read it aloud. Dear Claire, if you are reading this, then my son has finally shown his true colors. I am sorry. I tried to raise him differently, but I could not change who he chose to become. What I could do was make sure that, when this day arrived, you would have the power to protect yourself. The First Light Trust transfers controlling interest of all Weston Holdings to you upon proof of infidelity during your marriage. Use it well. Please take care of Emma. She is the only genuinely good thing my son ever had a hand in creating, and that is only because she is so very much like you. With love and deep regret. Dorothy. Claire held the letter against her chest. Rachel was crying without seeming to notice she was crying. Betty from the corner chair said very quietly, That woman knew her son. She did, Claire said. All those years ago, she knew. Emma reached across the table and took her mother's hand. What do we do now? She asked. Claire looked at her daughter, at her sister, at Betty and Evelyn, the entirely unlikely collection of people who had chosen to stand with her when every other support had been stripped away. Now, she said, her voice was steady in a way it had not been in months. We go back to that courtroom, and we finish this. The Manhattan Supreme Court was surrounded by news vans when they arrived. The story had grown considerably beyond a celebrity divorce. The rumors of offshore accounts and possible securities fraud had reached the financial press, and Weston Technologies stock had dropped 18% in the past week. Board members were present in the gallery. Several of them looked like they had not slept. Marcus Weston walked into the courthouse without Savannah Blake. She had, at some point in the preceding 72 hours, obtained her own legal representation and declined to appear. Marcus's stride was not what it had been on the first day. Victor Crane walked beside him, close enough that it was hard to tell who was supporting whom. Claire entered the courtroom with Evelyn, Emma, Rachel, and Betty. They walked in together at a measured pace and took their seats. All rise. The Honorable Judge, Patricia Monroe, presiding. Judge Monroe settled into her chair and looked out over the packed courtroom with the specific expression of a woman who has seen every version of this drama and remains unimpressed. "We are resuming Weston versus Weston," she said. "I understand there is significant new evidence to present. Miss Cross, you may proceed." Evelyn Cross stood up. In the 2 weeks since she had first introduced herself to Claire in a courthouse hallway, something had changed in her bearing. The nervous energy was still there, underneath, but it was organized now, directed. The young attorney who had been dismissed as out of her league looked, on this particular morning, precisely like a person who had been waiting their entire career for this exact moment. "Your Honor," she began, "the defense will today present evidence on three matters: the fraudulent origins of Weston Technologies, the systematic campaign conducted against the respondent during these proceedings, and the legal instrument that determines the actual ownership of the company Marcus Weston has claimed as his sole asset." Evelyn called Professor Harold Bennett via video link. He appeared on the screen at the front of the courtroom in his Vermont farmhouse, a stack of manila folders on the table in front of him. His voice was steady. His memory was precise. He described Claire's research in specific technical detail and confirmed, without hesitation, that the algorithm that became the foundation of Weston Technologies had been Claire Holloway's original work. Marcus Weston contributed nothing to the underlying mathematics, Professor Bennett said. "I was her advisor. I reviewed her work at every stage. The compression model she developed was entirely her own." Victor Crane cross-examined aggressively. Professor Bennett was unruffled. "Mr. Crane," the professor said at one point, "I have been a mathematician for 54 years. I know whose work is whose." Evelyn then called Emma Weston to the stand. Marcus leaned over to Crane. "What is she doing?" he said. "What does she have?" Crane said nothing. Emma took the oath and sat down. She looked at her father across the courtroom. Her eyes were not angry. They were sad and clear and entirely resolved. "Miss Weston," Evelyn began, "you previously testified against your mother in this proceeding. Has your testimony changed?" "Yes," Emma said. "I was manipulated by my father. He lied to me about my mother's history and her contributions to the company. He used me as a witness against her. I deeply regret what I said in this courtroom. It was not the truth." She presented the Project Silence documents. The courtroom listened in silence as Evelyn walked Emma through each phase: the financial isolation, the fabricated video, the family severance plan, the coaching of Emma's testimony. A woman in the gallery audibly gasped when Emma reached the part about being listed as an asset to be leveraged. Then Emma presented Gerald Morrison's files, the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the securities fraud, and finally, the First Light Trust. The gallery erupted. Board members were on their phones simultaneously. Reporters were typing with both thumbs. Victor Crane was staring at the trust documents with an expression that suggested he had, at some point in the last 30 seconds, understood exactly how wrong things had gone. "Order," Judge Monroe said. She did not need to raise her voice. The room quieted. "Mr. Crane," Judge Monroe said, "does the petitioner wish to respond to this evidence?" Victor Crane stood slowly. "Your Honor," he said, "we request time to examine the authenticity of these documents." Judge Monroe looked at him. "Mr. Crane," she said, "you have had 25 years to examine your client's finances. The court is not inclined to grant additional time for information your client has had in his possession for decades." She turned to Marcus directly. "Mr. Weston, would you like to address this evidence?" Marcus stood. His $12,000 suit looked wrong on him somehow, ill-fitting, like it belonged to a different version of himself. "This is fabricated," he said. "My mother was not in her right mind when she set up whatever trust this is supposed to be. My wife manipulated a dying woman. Do you have evidence that Dorothy Weston was not of sound mind at the time the trust was established?" Judge Monroe asked. "I will get evidence. I need time. You have had 20 years, Mr. Weston." She removed her glasses. "In my experience on this bench," she said, "a person who responds to specific documented evidence with unspecific denials is a person who has run out of alternative explanations." She put her glasses back on. "The court will take a brief recess to review all materials before issuing its ruling." The gavel came down. During the recess, Claire stepped outside to the courthouse steps. The November air was cold and clean. She could hear the sound of the city on all sides: traffic, voices, the distant percussion of construction somewhere to the north. Rachel appeared beside her. "How are you feeling?" Rachel asked. Claire thought about it. "Honestly, I feel like I spent 25 years being someone's shadow," she said, "and I am standing in the light." She looked at her sister. "Whatever happens in there, I already won. I have Emma back. I have you. I have the truth." Rachel squeezed her hand. "You're about to get a lot more than that," she said. "I can feel it." They went back inside. Judge Patricia Monroe returned to her seat and shuffled her papers for a moment that seemed to stretch considerably longer than it was. Then she began to speak. "In my 35 years on this bench," she said, "I have presided over cases that have tested my faith in the legal system, and cases that have restored it. This case falls into the second category. Not because justice was inevitable, but because of the extraordinary effort made by the respondent and her counsel to ensure that the truth could not be buried a second time." She looked directly at Marcus Weston. "Mr. Weston, you entered this courtroom believing that your money and your lawyers could erase 25 years of partnership. You believed that the woman who gave up her academic career to support your vision was worth exactly $5 million. You believed that intelligence and cruelty were interchangeable tools." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You were wrong on all 3 counts." She set a document aside. "The evidence presented in this proceeding is comprehensive and, in the court's view, irrefutable. Claire Holloway Weston developed the data compression algorithm that became the foundation of Weston Technologies. She did this while Marcus Weston was failing his undergraduate mathematics prerequisites. The patent filed in April of 1999 should have listed her name. It did not, because Marcus Weston filed it while his wife was recovering from a life-threatening childbirth complication. She held up the folder from Professor Bennett. The original research materials, dated and witnessed by an academic review board, prove beyond any reasonable doubt that this intellectual property belonged to Claire Weston. Marcus Weston built a $30 billion company on his wife's work and gave her nothing in return. Not credit, not acknowledgement, not partnership. Marcus shifted in his seat. His face was ashen. Furthermore, Judge Monroe continued, both prenuptial agreements are void. The court has already ruled on this matter. She set the prenup documents aside. The pattern of conduct documented in this case, the financial isolation, the fabricated evidence, the manipulation of the respondent's daughter, the coordinated campaign to destroy the reputation and resources of a woman who had done nothing but seek what was legally and morally hers. This pattern will be referred to the relevant federal and state authorities for further investigation. She held up the Project Silence documents. A 2-year operational plan to, and I am quoting from the document itself, achieve complete erasure of the respondent. This is not a divorce filing. This is a campaign of targeted destruction against a private individual. It is the kind of document that will be examined very carefully by prosecutors who handle these matters. Victor Crane was writing something on a notepad. His hand was not entirely steady. The court turns to the matter of the First Light Trust. Judge Monroe said. She held up the trust documents. This trust was established in 2005 by Dorothy Eleanor Weston, mother of the petitioner, with the legal assistance of the estate attorney Robert Fielding. Mrs. Weston Sr. was, at that time, 59 years old, in good health, and under no legal or documented cognitive impairment. The trust is legally valid. She read the terms aloud for the record. Upon verified proof of marital infidelity by Marcus Elliott Weston during the course of his marriage to Claire Elizabeth Holloway Weston, controlling interest in all Weston technology, holdings transfers automatically and irrevocably to the wronged spouse. She set the document down. The evidence of marital infidelity in this case is not in dispute. It has been presented by both parties and is extensively documented. The terms of the trust are therefore satisfied. She looked at Claire directly. Ms. Weston, your mother-in-law understood who her son was. She spent the last years of her life ensuring that when this day arrived, you would have the power to protect yourself. She used her late husband's resources to do so. This trust is the legal expression of two people's belief that you deserved better than what you were given. She looked back at the papers in front of her. It is the ruling of this court that Claire Holloway Weston is the rightful owner of the controlling interest in Weston Technologies as specified in the First Light Trust. All offshore accounts held by Marcus Weston in violation of mandatory marital financial disclosure requirements are frozen pending criminal investigation. The petition for divorce is granted. All assets not governed by the trust shall be divided according to equitable distribution principles. She paused. The evidence of securities fraud will be referred to the United States Attorney's Office. Victor Crane's conduct during these proceedings, specifically the evidence suggesting participation in the bribery of opposing counsel and the facilitation of fabricated evidence, will be referred to the State Bar Association for investigation. Crane set down his pen. Judge Monroe looked at Savannah Blake's empty seat. The court issues a subpoena for Savannah Blake regarding her role in commissioning and distributing falsified video evidence. Miss Blake is directed to surrender herself to the court within 48 hours. She gathered her papers. Marriage, she said, is not a transaction. It is not an asset acquisition. It is not a platform for the abuse of someone who trusted you. Mrs. Weston, you spent 25 years supporting a man who did not deserve you. You raised a daughter who, despite sustained manipulation, found her way back to the truth. You endured a campaign of destruction that would have broken most people. Her voice softened very slightly. You did not break. She raised her gavel. Justice is served. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. Marcus Weston sat frozen in his chair. 20 minutes ago, he had been a billionaire. Now he was facing criminal referrals, a bar complaint against his attorney, and a federal subpoena for his girlfriend. His daughter was across the aisle embracing his ex-wife. His attorney was very carefully not making eye contact with him. Two federal marshals appeared at the side entrance of the courtroom. They made their way through the gallery. They approached the petitioner's table. Marcus stood as they reached him. He turned and looked across the aisle at Claire. She met his eyes. She did not flinch. She did not gloat. She simply looked at him with the calm clarity of someone who has nothing left to be afraid of. Then she turned away. The marshals guided Marcus Weston toward the side door. He stumbled slightly on the first step. Rachel, from immediately behind Claire's left shoulder, whispered to Betty. He stumbled. Betty, from Claire's right, I saw. Rachel. That is enough for me. Outside, on the courthouse steps, in the cold November air, with camera flashes going off, and reporters shouting questions Claire could not quite hear, Rachel appeared beside her. So, Rachel said, you own a $30 billion company. Apparently, Claire said. Rachel thought about this for a moment. Does that mean you can finally fix the heating in my apartment? Claire laughed. It was real laughter, unguarded and surprised out of her, the kind that comes when something is genuinely funny after a long time of nothing being funny at all. It was the first real laugh of the story. It felt like the beginning of something. 6 months after the verdict, Claire Weston stood at the window of her office on the 32nd floor of what was now called First Light Technologies. The name change had been her first official act as chairwoman of the board, a tribute to the trust Dorothy and Edward Weston had built for her, a reminder every time she walked into the building of what it had cost and what it meant. The Manhattan skyline stretched before her in the spring morning light. It was the same view Marcus had enjoyed for 20 years. Claire spent very little time looking at it. There was too much work to do. Her assistant knocked and opened the door. Your 11 o'clock is here. Evelyn Cross walked in looking considerably different from the nervous young attorney who had approached Claire in a courthouse hallway with a personal vendetta and not much else. She was now head of First Light's legal department. She had a staff of 22. Victor Crane had lost his law license 3 months ago. He was appealing. He would lose that too. The restructuring is complete, Evelyn said, setting a folder on Claire's desk. Total offshore asset recovery, $214 million. Claire looked at the number. Transfer it all to the foundation account. Every penny, Evelyn confirmed. Every penny. The First Light Foundation had been Claire's second major initiative. It provided legal assistance and financial support to women navigating difficult divorces, particularly those facing opponents with significantly greater resources. In 6 months, they had helped 463 women. Evelyn's team had won 61% of the contested cases they had taken on. Emma knocked and entered, carrying a laptop and looking like someone who had stayed up too late and did not regret it. Mom. The beta test results came in. Emma had joined First Light Technologies as head of the new AI ethics division. Her team was developing educational software, advertiser-friendly, technology designed, as Claire put it in the board presentation, to actually help people rather than simply to profit from them. Test scores improved by 40% across all pilot schools, Emma said. Teachers are calling it the most effective adaptive learning tool they have used. She set the laptop on the desk. The schools want to expand immediately. Schedule a board meeting for next week, Claire said. We talk about scaling. Emma made a note. Then she hesitated. Mom, Dad's sentencing hearing is next month. Claire's expression remained neutral. His attorney reached out. He wants to see me, Emma said. Claire waited. I think I need to go, Emma said, not to forgive him. I do not know if I will ever be able to do that. but to finally say what I should have said a year ago. Claire walked around the desk and took Emma's hands. That is your choice, she said. Whatever you decide, I support you completely. She looked at her daughter. Just remember, you do not owe him anything, not forgiveness, not an explanation, not even your presence. You go because you choose to, not because he deserves it. Emma hugged her mother. I know, she said. Thank you for understanding. After Emma left, Claire sat at her desk for a moment in the quiet. Through the glass wall of her office, she could see the open-plan floor, the team at their desks, the whiteboards covered in project timelines. A functioning thing, a living thing that she had helped build, this time with her name on it. She thought about what it had cost to get here. She thought about the floor of the empty office with $47 and a folder of documents. The brick through Rachel's window, Emma's face on the witness stand, saying the words Marcus had coached her to say. The night she had cried on Rachel's kitchen floor and Rachel had simply sat beside her and stayed. Every single thing that had been taken from her had, in the end, been returned, and the things that could not be returned. The years, the youth, the trust, the naive belief that love made people good, those she had learned to carry differently, not as losses, as tuition. She picked up her phone and called Rachel. The bakery, Rachel answered, slightly breathless, which meant she was behind the counter. Are you free for lunch? Claire asked. I have a 6-month waiting list, Rachel said. For you, I will move some people around. Here is what Claire Weston wrote in her memoir, published 2 years after the verdict, which spent 14 weeks on the bestseller list, and was adapted into a documentary that a great many women watched in their living rooms and felt significantly less alone afterward. She wrote, The moment I stopped trying to save the marriage and started trying to save myself, that was the moment everything changed. Not because giving up on the marriage was easy, it was the hardest thing I ever did, but because I had spent 25 years directing all of my considerable energy toward maintaining something that was quietly consuming me. And the day I redirected that energy toward myself, toward the truth, toward the people who actually loved me, everything I thought I had lost became available again. You cannot pour from an empty cup. But more than that, you cannot fight from your knees. At some point, you have to stand up, even if your legs are shaking, especially then. 1 year after the verdict, an anonymous envelope arrived at Claire's office. No return address. Inside, a USB drive and a handwritten note. Mrs. Weston, your husband was not the only one with secrets. There are 14 others. I was one of them. The drive has everything. Maybe it is finally time someone told the whole story. A friend. The files were devastating. 14 women, NDAs, settlements, 15 years of systematic harassment and abuse of power buried under legal agreements that had cost Marcus somewhere in the range of $11 million to maintain. Claire sat at her desk for a long time after she read through the files. Then she called Evelyn. I want to find them, she said. Everyone. I want to give them the choice I never had. Over the following 3 months, she and Evelyn quietly reached out. Some women had moved on and wanted no part of reopening the past. Claire respected that absolutely. But 11 of the 14 said yes. They came to a conference room at the First Light Foundation. They sat in a circle and shared their stories for the first time with each other in a room where they had been promised absolute safety. When the last woman finished, Claire stood up. Your story matters, she said. Your voice matters. And you are not alone anymore. We were kept apart because isolated people are easier to silence. We are not isolated anymore. The women in that room, all 11 of them, chose to come forward together. The story broke 3 weeks later. Marcus Weston's existing sentence was extended pending investigation of additional charges. The media coverage was significant. But for Claire, the public reckoning mattered less than what she watched happen in that conference room. 11 women who had been carrying something alone for years, finally setting it down in the company of people who understood. On the first anniversary of the verdict, Claire held a small dinner at Rachel's bakery. Just family. Rachel and Emma, Betty and Evelyn, the people who had stayed. Rachel's toast, to the quietest person in the room, who turned out to be the most dangerous. Everyone laughed. Claire's toast, to family, the one you are born with and the one you choose. They clinked glasses. After dinner, Claire and Emma stepped outside. The November air was cold and clear, the same cold as the day they had walked out of the courthouse together. Brooklyn's streetlights, stars visible between the buildings. "Do you think Grandma Dorothy knew it would end like this?" Emma asked. Claire looked up at the sky. "I think Dorothy knew her son better than anyone," she said. "And I think she knew that someday you would find your way back to the truth." She put her arm around her daughter. "She believed in me when I did not believe in myself. She trusted that the truth would survive long enough to matter. That is its own kind of love." Emma leaned into her mother. Through the bakery window, they could see Rachel laughing at something Betty had said. Something that had made Betty cover her mouth with both hands, trying to contain it. Evelyn was refilling wine glasses and looking more relaxed than Claire had ever seen her. It looked like a family. It was a family. And Claire understood, standing on that Brooklyn sidewalk in the November cold, that this, exactly this, was the thing she had been fighting for. Not the company, not the money, not the verdict, this room full of people who loved her, this daughter beside her, this laughter coming through the glass. She had spent 25 years being someone's shadow. She was standing in the light now. She was never going back, disclaimer. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful entertainment with real-life lessons. Every story we create is designed not just to entertain, but to inspire, educate, and remind you that no matter how dark things seem, the truth always finds a way to rise. Thank you for being part of our community.